The Atheist Debates Patreon project presents Inconsistent Revelation Solved? Well, spoiler alert, probably not. But for those who aren't aware, there are, in addition to the arguments for the existence of gods, which fall into a lot of different categories, there are, in fact, arguments against the existence of gods. They tend to be categorized in part based as responses to the categories of arguments for God or objections to those things. And they tend to only apply to certain gods. An argument against the Trinity is obviously an argument against a particular version of Christianity and does not mean that it's an argument against, Scientology or Hinduism. There's a lot of different potential arguments out of there. One of my favorites, or at least favorites in the arguments against gods, applies to most versions of Christianity and the God of classical theism and things like that. And it's not divine hiddenness. I mean, I've talked about divine hiddenness a lot. This could be viewed as related to that because there is a hiddenness aspect to it, but it's arguments from inconsistent revelation. And that is that supposedly people are getting messages from a God, but these messages are not consistent. They are leading to thousands of denominations, sometimes many different religions. Sometimes it's very difficult to make sense of a world where people are getting revelations or claiming to get revelations from a God that are inconsistent. Is God a prankster? Is he mumbling? But when we have conversations about what sort of evidence, what would change your mind? What would change your mind? I've told the story before about I came up with my answer to what would change your mind. And I think either on the fly on an episode of the Atheist Experience or just before it, perhaps in a conversation with Tracy Harris. But my answer has remained for years now. What would change my mind about my position on the existence of God? Evidence for it. But the real answer is that either God exists or he doesn't. If he doesn't exist, we're already done. There's nothing that's going to change that until God comes into existence. If God exists, that God either wants me to know he exists or he doesn't. If he doesn't, we're also done. But if he does want me to know it exists, then God should have some mechanism by which he can demonstrate his existence. And the fact that that hasn't happened means that either God doesn't exist or doesn't want me to know he exists. Either way, it's not my problem. This I came up with in part because I was replying to or responding to atheists who were saying, what if there was writing in the sky that said, I am the Lord thy God, blah, 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 blah. And I pointed out that Arthur C. Clarke famously pointed out that any sufficiently advanced technology is indistinguishable from magic. If you don't understand things, everything looks like it could be magic, even if it isn't. And if you don't understand it, the natural and the supernatural both somehow take equal plausibility for some. Imagine I'm listening to a radio broadcast and they tell me, there's writing in the sky right now. It's written in flames and it says, I am the Lord thy God. And it's in English. I don't know what the explanation for that is, but it's not enough to say that it was in fact written by God. If it was, I should just start every one of my videos with, hi, I'm God. You need to do everything that I say and agree with my thoughts. Because saying it don't make it so. But let's imagine that writing actually appeared in a way that everybody could read it in whatever language they were capable of reading. Well, I don't know what sort of technology might be able to project thoughts into someone's head, but I'd say that was at least much more impressive tech, which could include God tech. I'm saying tech as the substitute here. I have no way of ruling out that it came from a God, but I also have no way of distinguishing between God tech and natural tech from civilizations I don't understand. But imagine that instead of that, I'm hearing a message in my head, and it's in a language that I don't understand. But it is clearly feels like a conversation. Like it says a word very clearly, and then another word. And I can say, can you repeat that? And it will say that word again. And it's in a language that I don't understand, but it's still a language known on earth. For example, I pretty much don't speak any language other than English, but I do know a little Spanish and some other stuff. So let's pick Russian. I don't speak Russian. I don't know much of anything about Russian. I don't even get the letters right. I don't get pronunciation right. Cyrillic just looks strange to me. And let's imagine that I'm getting a message where I hear a Russian word. I don't even know it's Russian to begin with, apart from other languages that I don't know. And I sort of see symbols, and they appear to be like Cyrillic lettering. I could write down those symbols, and I could record myself just relaying the message exactly as it is. So the word comes in my head and I say the word. Another word comes in my head, I say the word. I could record that. We could then take that recording to someone who knows and understands Russian or whatever the language happens to be. We're going with Russian. And they could say, oh yeah, this message says, I am the Lord thy God. Would we have good reason to believe that a God exists now? Maybe not. Probably not. Because I still don't know how to tell the difference between a God tech that can make me think and see symbols that I don't know and understand, and just an alien tech or human tech that I don't understand. Maybe we've tapped the ability to broadcast directly into somebody's brain. So despite the fact that I'm getting messages and I can have them translated, I still can't make a conclusion about the origin of those messages. Even if we keep going, eventually it could give me an encyclopedia-length dissertation of who it is, what it wants, and then you'd be in this position where you'd either have to say, you know what, it's given me so much correct information that I'm just going to go ahead and accept that this is God for all intents and purposes, or that this is the closest thing to a God that I am aware of. And since I'm getting messages, and those messages are useful, I can proportion my confidence in the reliability of those messages based on what I do and don't understand and how consistently they demonstrate their reliability. I may very well, in that scenario, have sufficient evidentiary warrant to reach the conclusion that either I am communicating with a God, or that whatever is communicating with me is indistinguishable from a God from my perspective. That is a reasonable potential conclusion, provided we can verify that there's not something else going on. But what would be proof for me, or what would be sufficient evidence for me, doesn't mean it's sufficient evidence for you. So you could hear my story, and you could hear about the messages that I'm getting, and then read the statements after they've been translated, and you would now have access to all the same information that I did, except that you wouldn't have experienced the revelation, and you don't know whether or not I secretly know and understand Russian or whatever language it is. Maybe I've spent the last 30 years without telling anybody, spending 2 hours a night studying and learning to become proficient in Russian, and I've just been hiding it so that I could play this, run this long con. You don't know that because you don't have access to my mind. Cool. But what if whatever's broadcasting to my mind also starts broadcasting to yours? Now, if you don't understand things, that's fine. But you can still verify what's actually happening or what's going on. We wouldn't be able to confirm that it was in fact a God And I know there's people out there he goes again, Matt's hyper-skepticism saying, obviously it's a God, but Matt's just not willing to say it's a God. Okay, if you think it's obviously God, cool. I've already given as much concession here as I think is warranted by a reasonable implementation of skepticism and good standards of evidence, which is I don't know exactly what's going on, but I am absolutely convinced that I'm getting messages. Even though you don't know whether or not I speak Russian, I know I don't, and I know I'm confused and surprised by these messages, and we've verified that somebody else can independently translate them. But the issue isn't why am I unconvinced that it's a God? It's why are you convinced that it is a God? What have you added to my model that says, oh, that's definitely a God? Because we don't have examples of writing in the sky that is legible to all. We don't have examples of consistent private revelation. We have tons of examples of claims of inconsistent revelation, but this would be pretty straightforward. And the question is, if God's willing to reveal itself to me in that way, or whoever is pretending to be God is willing to do it to me that way, and I can then have evidentiary warrant of that, then why can't God do it to you, and you, and you, and you? And if God does it for 5 of us, and we're all getting the same message that none of us understand, and it's being consistently translated, that is now sufficient warrant to believe that we are in fact receiving some message, unless there's some way to demonstrate that we all colluded and memorized in a volume of encyclopedias. But we could also do it if we're actually able to communicate by saying, hey, can you repeat that? And it repeats it. You could set us all down in isolated booths, ask all of us questions we haven't been asked before, and whether the God tech or alien tech, whatever it is that is sending a message to us, can send all of us the exact same word-for-word answer to the question that you presented, something we couldn't have prepared for. There are a number of ways to whittle this down. Still, doesn't confirm that it's a God, but that's okay. I'm giving an example. We have no examples of writing in the sky or consistent private revelation. I'm giving a hypothetical example of something that would be vastly closer to affirming God claims as plausible. And I'm saying that's not enough, but it would be a great start. And the believers are saying, well, that's why God won't do it. He already knows you're not going to be convinced, so why would he do that? Well, I just explained what would be convincing. Which means if God knows me and knows what would be convincing, why hasn't he done that? Why is it that when I point out when people are like, what sort of evidence would convince you? And I present the evidence that would at least begin to convince me. Well, God won't do that because he knows it won't completely convince you. Well, cool story. But the point is that if God created us and he wants us to know he exists, he should be capable of providing evidence that can't be confused with, this is just tech I don't understand. And that never happens. Oh yeah, people claim it does. People claim to be getting revelations from God, just like people claim to be communicating with the dead, but they're claiming something weaker than getting the message in a language that you don't know. Imagine Joseph Smith, the founder of Mormonism, translating with his seer stone by putting the plates in the hat. That's an instance where he's doing the translation. That is so obviously easily fakeable that it is a poor system for establishing that you're receiving a message from a God. The message that I'm talking about would be vastly superior. If Joseph Smith was talking to the actual God, instead of giving Joseph Smith seer stones that he has to hide and plates that he has to hide or replace, and allowing him to just translate it and somebody to write it down, it would be great if anybody who looked into the hat and looked at the stone or looked through the seer stone into the hat would see something in a language they don't understand, but can relate to someone who does understand it. Oddly, that extra step adds something important. Essentially, a version of repeatability and independent verifiability. How do you prove that Joseph Smith didn't know the language? You can't. But if Joseph Smith is getting this message and 5 other people are getting this message, each one of them knows that they don't know that language. I mean, you could talk to me in Russian all day long, and I'm unlikely to understand much of anything you ever say. I'm certainly not remotely able to convey a complex philosophical thought in Russian. I can't do it in any language. I took 2 years of Spanish in high school. I would struggle to get a thought out that is robust in Spanish, but I at least know I don't speak that. I don't speak Russian. At least with this model, we would now have a clear message to evaluate. Instead of God picking a random person and giving them a revelation to pass on to the rest of us, something that we can't verify at all, just like aliens showing up and abducting Jim Bob from his trailer home where nobody else sees it. Instead, God could give that revelation to multiple people. And if he can give that revelation to multiple people, why can't he give it to all of us? So we're back to this problem of inconsistent revelation. And why is a Damascus Road experience good enough for Saul, but not for the rest of us? Why is God playing favorites? Why is God giving some people seemingly strong evidential warrant for believing, and others got to take it more on faith? Why does this God play favorites? Isn't it more reasonable that he's not playing favorites and that people are just wrong and misunderstanding and believing that they're getting revelations when they're not? Isn't it more likely? Isn't almost any natural explanation more likely? Why don't we get something extraordinary? Why don't we get regrown limbs? Why don't miracles happen at astonishing rates in ways that are incredibly impressive? Well, God's got his reasons. And so we don't get to really depend on that. Maybe God's got a good reason for doing that. But if God can reveal himself to one person clearly, what's the reason he can't reveal himself to all of us clearly? Well, you've hardened your heart to God. No, I haven't hardened my heart or my mind to a God. If there is a God and he wants to reveal himself to me, I'm completely open. Right now, make it so. I'm sitting here doing a video. I could do it in a live. I'm live all the time on the shows. God could show up in a way that absolutely convinces me. I'm not sure what it is, but he doesn't. We don't get anything close. And this sort of getting a message that several other people are getting independently inside of our heads would at least show that something is clearly communicating with people. There are ways to test that claim. Why isn't God willing to subject itself to any sort of reliable test? And more important than that, why is it that absent any reliable test, people are still willing and eager to believe? I don't know. I think we have good reasons to be wrong. Our fears, our desires, the community that we seem to need, the answers that we desperately want, the fact that we're frustrated about life ending, terrified of what comes next. Does anything come next? Is my non-existence something I will experience? All of these things, in addition to the usefulness of religious teachings to manipulating and controlling people, even though it's not saying that's a primary reason, all of those things are sufficient justifications for false religions to propagate. Where's the sufficient reason for the true one to be believed to be true? And why hasn't God done anything to keep us from buying into so many false ones? My answer is because he probably doesn't exist. And he hasn't done anything to dissuade me from that, as I tell person after person after person after person. So evidently I'm part of God's plan to destroy the world, which is weird because I'm actively working to not allow the continued destruction of it. I wish God would show up and maybe have a conversation with me someday to explain all of this confusion. See you next time. Bye-bye.